On day 24, we will leave Baltimore and head to Philadelphia, where we'll be spending the next 2 days. While we're in Philadelphia, we'll be looking at Independence Park, Christ Church Burial Grounds, Betsy Ross House, Franklin Court, and other places. Let's get on our way out of Baltimore, and as you can see as we drive along, we'll be passing many row houses, many of which are boarded up or in other states of disrepair. And now we're arriving in downtown Philadelphia. You can see here that the row houses look different than they did in Baltimore. Many of the apartments are over shops. In downtown Philadelphia, we'll be looking around this area for the next few hours. We will park at the National Constitution Center, go to the Visitor Center, go to Declaration House, President's House site, the Liberty Bell Center. Then we'll go over to Independence Hall and take a tour, go to Benjamin Franklin Museum, then Market Street Houses, go see Benjamin Franklin's grave before heading back to the National Constitution Center. All of these sites are located right in the middle of downtown Philadelphia. First stop will be the Visitor Center, where we'll be able to look at some museum displays and pick up our tickets for going to Independence Hall, and also get your picture taken with Benjamin Franklin. Since the U.S. government was here for many years until Washington was built, we'll go see the President's House. This is what it looked like, but it was demolished in 1832 and stores built here, and then the stores were demolished in 1952. Today they have kind of ghosted in what the house would have looked like, and they have done archaeological excavations to see the department store foundations and the President's House foundations. And this is what it would have probably looked like in Washington State, with the state dining room having a bay window. They have not tried to reconstruct the house, but what they have done is they have kind of ghosted it in with windows and chimneys and walls partly built in order to give you an idea of what it would have looked like on the inside. And you can go around and see the various exhibits and displays inside. And now as we move through the President's House, we come to the Liberty Bell Center, as you can see here. This aerial view shows it, but it also shows that there's no President's House excavations, which were done later. This was put up as the Pennsylvania State House bell in 1753. There's no evidence that this bell rang on July the 4th, 1776 to proclaim independence. In fact, at that time, it was so heavy they were afraid it'd collapse the steeple. In 1777, patriots took it down to avoid it being captured. And no, Deborah didn't crack it. It cracked in 1752 at an early date, was repaired several times, and then in 1846 cracked so bad that they couldn't repair it, and it was retired. Around the top it says, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof, by order of the Assembly of the Province of Pennsylvania for the State House in Philad, by Pass and Stowe." And yes, all of the spelling errors are actually on the bell. It sits in a glass enclosure at the end of the Liberty Bell building. Next, we're going to move from the Liberty Bell building down to Independence Hall and be looking around there some. This building was started in 1732 and completed in 1756 and was meant to be the State House of the Pennsylvania colony. You can see various buildings scattered around it. We'll be visiting almost all of them. This is a concept of what it looked like in those early days. You may recognize it from here. Some of you have actually touched $100 bills. Out in front is a statue of George Washington. In the East Wing, we find the Great Essentials exhibit. 3 major documents were written here, debated, and signed here. The Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution of the United States. We will start off our visit to Independence Hall in the orientation in the West Wing. Jeff Sievert will be our guide.
So basically raise and govern themselves, and they get used to it.
We now move to the main building and we'll look at the Supreme Court room first.
Differences in this courtroom from modern courtrooms of today. First one is this round table up front. It's actually where both the defense and prosecuting attorneys would sit. Back then they shared a table, unlike today where they have their own separate tables. Also, the item I'm standing in is no longer used in American courtrooms today, but a guest would be in here during the trial.
The defendant?
Yeah, the defendant or the accused. This was actually known as the prisoner's dock. So if you want to try, you would stand in here throughout your trial, facing the judge. Revolution. The one event that will connect this room to the American Revolution, though, occurs on July 8th of 1776. It's on that day, out behind Independence Hall, we have the first ever public reading of the Declaration of Independence. It's read by Colonel John Nixon, an officer in the local militia. When he gets done reading that declaration, some of his fellow militia members come into this room and tear down an item that used to be on that wall where that painting is today. Painting is a representation of the coat of arms for the state of Pennsylvania dating back to 1785, a symbol of the power and authority of the state here in the courtroom. Well, up until the afternoon of July 8th, a very different symbol is up on the wall. It would have looked like this. It's King George III's coat of arms, symbol of his power and authority here in the courtroom. However, these militia members just got done hearing the reading of the Declaration of Independence, which basically said, hey, we don't recognize this guy's power and authority anymore. They take it off the wall, they drag it through the streets of Philadelphia, and they ultimately throw it on top of a bonfire, thereby destroying that connection between them and Great Britain.
Now it's time to move across the hall to the assembly room where all the debating took place.
Into the far right and the far left. Please not stop in the center. A group of colonists dressed up as Native Americans dumped a cargo of 3 British East Indian ships of their tea into Boston Harbor. Now this protest wasn't necessarily over the fact that there was a tax on tea. There had been a tax on tea before, but some things had changed. The British East India Company now had a sole monopoly on the importation of tea to the British colonies. Colonists had been purchasing them from the British and the French. Also, they were allowed to directly import it, making sure they could bypass Britain, which bypassed the tax. Also, the colonists had been smuggling tea in. So this is going to be bad for the smugglers because the British East India Company now can sell the tea for cheaper than the colonists could smuggle it in. It's not really good for business. Not particularly happy about it. Some of the revenue from this tax was supposed to be used to pay the salaries for royal governors and royal judges. And the coercive acts basically trying to get the colonists to basically heed the rule of Parliament. Close the port of Boston to all shipments except for food and fuel. The royal governor is replaced, which the colonists had been asking for, but the replacement is going to be a military officer, General Thomas Gage. The town hall meetings, which were the political lifeblood of the colonies, be made illegal. All this will basically remain in place until the colonists pay for the tea and basically are sufficiently sorry for what they've done. Now we start meeting here for the Second Continental Congress in May of 1775. They already know about the battles of Lexington and Concord, but they don't call for independence immediately. And those who still hold out hope that they can reconcile with Great Britain, on July 5th of 1775, they approve what's known as the Olive Branch Petition. Petition basically sent to the king that says, hey king, we are loyal subjects to you, but our rights are being violated. King, help us out. Now the king receives this petition but never reads it. He does not recognize the Second Continental Congress as a legitimate political body. It has no right to exist, therefore he has no reason to read any petitions from it. He and ultimately Parliament will later decide that these colonies are in open rebellion, and the only way to deal with open rebellion is with force. Well, the colonists aren't sitting here twiddling their thumbs waiting for a response. In fact, in June of 1775, the Virginian becomes named Commander-in-Chief of what becomes the Continental Army. Who is that Virginian?
George Washington.
George Washington. So we had the beginnings of an army. We had that declared independence. It's not going to be until June of 1776 that a Virginian puts forth a resolution calling for that very thing. The problem is not all the colonies have given their delegates permission to vote for independence. So on June 11th, they created a 5-man committee to come up with a draft declaration that would explain their reasons for declaring independence if they happen to do so. Among these members is going to be Thomas Jefferson, the youngest delegate at the convention, but known as a very good writer. He will ultimately be tasked with the job of creating that rough draft from the 5-man committee. About 2.5 weeks, he does create a draft in addition to 3 draft constitutions for his home state of Virginia. Lets his fellow committee members look over that draft. A few suggestions are made, and on June 28th, the committee turns in that draft declaration. But it sits there. They haven't dealt with that first resolution calling for independence. It's not until July 2nd that Richard Henry Lee's resolution is approved. But they agree to all these changes on July 4th of 1776. And that'll be the day that we end up choosing to celebrate independence, even though it's not a day that they'll sign it. Keep in mind, Great Britain's they're going to hear about this and they're not going to just give up and go, all right, I guess they don't like us, let them go. No, they're going to fight. But as I said across the hallway, not all colonists support independence. So just as those colonists who want their independence will take up arms to gain it, there will be colonists who will take up arms in the name of king to defend the rights of the king. And the British have to now figure out how are they going to work together. During the American Revolution, they come up with what would be known as the Articles of Confederation. It's a weak centralized government in which the states have much of the power. After all, there's on September 17th of 1787 that they signed the Constitution here in this room. Now, the only piece of furniture that was here for that event, that chair up on the platform. It's where George Washington sat throughout much of the convention. On the day of the signing, Benjamin Franklin, delegate from Pennsylvania, makes a comment about the half-sun carved in the back of the president's chair. Asked himself throughout the convention, he asked himself whether he thought the sun was rising or setting. Now that he had the happiness to know that it was a rising sun. Some thought that Franklin wasn't talking about the sun itself, he was talking about here to create the U.S. Constitution. Same Constitution that we live under today, except we made 27 changes to it since then.
Upstairs, there's a long room for state functions of various kinds.
Meeting room is not large enough. This room over here to the right is where the colonial governor met.
The colonial governor's office is also located here. Now we'll move from Independence Hall over to the Congress Hall. This is where the U.S. government met for many years before Washington.
Everybody knew before the federal government arrived in Philadelphia that they were only going to be here for 10 years while the new Capitol was under construction. So, the federal government did not build their own facilities here in Philadelphia, they borrowed. Now, the government of Philadelphia, they made sure that the federal government got whatever they wanted. And of course, their big hope was that by 1800, the federal government would be so comfortable here, of course they would decide that they really did not want to leave and they could stay, which didn't work at all. But certainly not for lack of Philadelphia's government trying. And this building is a perfect example of that. This building was 1 year old. The most important thing that occurred here was the inauguration of John Adams. George Washington is still the only president in the history of the United States who never campaigned for office. In fact, whenever the subject was brought up, he would tell people that he wasn't even qualified to be president because he was a soldier. He had never been a politician. And despite all that, he's still the only president to ever be unanimously elected. He received every single electoral vote cast for 2 terms. At the end of 8 years, he was still very popular. But he began to realize toward the end of his second term that he really wasn't aging well. In fact, his health was declining rapidly. It was time to go, and he knew it. So he let it be known that he would not be serving a 3rd term, even if he was yet again unanimously elected. At the end of 8 years, George Washington was headed home because he was done. Well, John Adams was elected to replace him. Just about where these 2 tables are, March the 4th, 1797 at noon. In a ceremony that lasted about a half an hour, John Adams was sworn in as the 2nd president of the United States, and George Washington showed up in person to symbolically hand the presidency over to John Adams. So that peaceful transfer of power, convinced most people who still had doubts about how things were working under the Constitution that the government was indeed functioning the way it had been intended.
In the East Committee Room, there was a portrait of Louis VI of France, who helped our nation with independence. And when we move over to the West Committee Room, there we find Marie Antoinette.
Fabrics that was pasted on the walls for soundproofing. It's hard to hold a glass or something up and try to eavesdrop if there's cloth stayed on, the door stayed open. So even with the vice president killing the leader of the opposition, they still got it.
The gift shop is located on the other side of Independence Hall. And now it's time to head down the street to Declaration House. This is where Thomas Jefferson was actually staying as he wrote the Declaration of Independence. This is not the original building. In the 1800s, the Gratz family owned it, and in 1883 it was torn down. Then a bank was built on the site, later Tom Thumb Restaurant, and now the Park Service has rebuilt it to look like the original house. It was closed when we arrived, so these are some pictures off the internet from the National Park Service website of what the interior looks like. Now we'll move back across Independence Park, eat along the way, and go to the Benjamin Franklin Museum. Along the way we'll see various historical things like monuments, and also the Second National Bank, which is now an art museum, the Quaker Meeting House, and you're also never really sure who you might see along the way. His original house and printing shop are not here anymore, but Franklin Court is where they would have been, and you can still see a few of the things from the court, and there is a post office here now. Through this archway, Benjamin Franklin actually walked, and here's where he drew his water, and here's where he did his business. The house and printing shop have been ghosted in with steel structures, so you can see where they would have stood. And now it's time for us to visit the museum and find out more about Franklin himself. This museum has many exhibits inside it. It also includes a musical instrument that Benjamin Franklin invented, the glass harmonica. Let's listen to this instrument.
Franklin saw someone playing a set of water-tuned wine glasses and thought that this would be a more convenient arrangement. He wanted to do away with the water tuning and wanted to have a lot more glasses and be able to play more than two at a time. So voila, one of Franklin's favorite inventions. So these are all basically custom-blown wine glasses, and they're all nested inside of each other, and the whole assembly is turning so you can play it somewhat piano-like. And Mozart also wrote some music for it. Here's a bit of a solo piece that he wrote.
Now it's time to move from Franklin Court to Market Street houses and then over to Benjamin Franklin's grave in Christ Church burial place. Now Christ Church is not located by its cemetery, it's about 4 blocks away. The cemetery, or burial grounds as they call it, is located right next to Independence Mall and was starting to bury here in 1719. There are many famous people buried here, including 5 signers of the Declaration of Independence, and Benjamin Franklin's grave is in the corner here. So people can see the grave without having to go into the cemetery. They put in a wrought iron fence so you can look over at it, and many people do come by. You never know who you will find coming to visit this grave. Both Benjamin Franklin and his wife Deborah are buried here. Now we'll move back to National Constitution Center, where we're parked, and look there for just a few minutes. National Constitution Center. Here they have a recreation of the scene of the signing of the Constitution of the United States, and you can even sign your name to it. Now we'll be leaving this area and heading over to the Betsy Ross house. This house is where Betsy Ross had her upholstery shop, and George Washington wanted her to make a flag for him. And she made flags for 50 more years. This is what it looked like early, and as you can see, the house on the right today. It did have a back part on it at one time that it doesn't have now. Now this museum was again closed when we got here, So these pictures are off their website of what the inside might have looked like.
One of these, 13 stars and stripes, representing our 13 colonies, of course. Fine design for a flag, but I did not come up with it. George Washington came here to this upholstery shop with a drawing of what this flag was supposed to look like, and I followed the drawing slightly. But you see, I wanted him to change something about that drawing. General Washington, he had asked if I could put 6 points around each and every one of those stars for the flag. 6-pointed stars, that's what he wanted. But I'm a smart businesswoman, so I told him no to 6-pointed stars. They were going to take too long to make. He wanted this flag finished as fast as possible, after all, so I suggested a change to the stars. Perhaps, I told him, if he allowed me to put 5 points on each of those stars, I could finish that flag in a fast time. Now, he wanted to know exactly what I meant, so I told him I would show him, demonstrate exactly how fast and easy those 5-pointed stars are. Now, would you like to see how fast and easy it is to cut out those 5-pointed stars? I will show you. You will be so impressed. Start with a rectangle, fold it in half. Take the top corner, fold it to the center, fold over that long bottom to meet in the middle, and then fold the last part down so it all lines up nice and even. Now take your scissors, make one snip at a nice angle, and open that piece of paper up, and there's your 5-pointed star. Now, of course,
Betsy and her seamstress worked on the flag, and then it was presented to General Washington, and he was very happy with it. And this is the first flag of our nation. And now it's time to move over from Betsy Ross House to the Edgar Allan Poe Historical. This site was also closed when we got to it, so we will look around the inside by using things from the website.
My name is Edgar Poe. I'm a writer, critic, editor, but above all else, a poet. He's born in Boston, he lives in Baltimore, he lives in Richmond, he lives in Scotland for a bit, he lives in England. He's up in New York, he's in Philadelphia, he's in New York again, he travels to Richmond and dies in Baltimore. You know, so all these places have claim to...
Poe did much of his writing here in Philadelphia and in fact invented the murder mystery genre here. The upstairs is in pretty poor condition, so they use wall hangings to give you an idea of what it might have looked like, and even a picture in the window to see what it looked like outside. And this brings us to the end of day 24.